This is going to be an interesting and I think exciting little mini-series within our greater series of Hebrews. I think I alluded to this a few weeks ago, but it's been a while since we were together, so you may not specifically remember. But we're actually the verses that we're going to talk about today in Hebrews are going to lead up to and launch us into a little mini-series about the covenants. This is kind of like, if you remember back in chapter 3, when the author of Hebrews quoted from Psalm 110, and then that led us into referencing what Psalm 110 was about and took us back into Exodus, and we used that as a springboard to talk about the context of that quote, to help us appreciate the context of his point that he was making in Hebrews. Well, a similar thing is happening here, because he's going to now, in these verses we're going to talk about today, he is going to lead up to talking about this thing called the New Covenant. Now, he's mentioned the word covenant before, back in chapter 6, and we kind of brushed up against it then, but I saved any detailed discussion of it for here, simply because this is where he's going to lead up to talking about the New Covenant. And so, in order for us to really appreciate the context and significance of that, we're going to jump back into our time machine, and we're going to go back into Genesis chapter 6. And this will, and it'll be kind of a mini-series about the covenants that will help us to appreciate and understand the depth of the context that the author of Hebrews is talking about in chapter 8. So, we'll just since it's been a few weeks since we were together, just kind of a quick recap of the beginning of chapter 8, as you'll recall. The author of Hebrews was talking about the tabernacle and how the human high priests were serving in the tabernacle, doing what they did, but that the tabernacle was just a copy of the true heavenly tabernacle where our great high priest, Jesus Christ, actually did his priestly work. And once again, just like his tactic has been ever since the beginning of this book, to compare and contrast the superiority of Christ as the great high priest. And the first part of the chapter was part of that in showing the significance of the tabernacle on earth versus what it was a shadow of, or a picture of, or a representation of, the real heavenly tabernacle, the abode of God, where the real work of redemption occurred. So on the heels of that, really almost continuing on the same thought, is where we pick up in verse 6, because we left off at verse 5. And so in verse 6 he says, "But the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is the mediator is superior to the old one, and it is founded on better promises." So this particular verse, he's talking essentially about the ministry that Jesus performed and the covenant he represented. He talks about this word ministry. We mentioned this before because he used this word in previous chapters. So we've talked about it before, but I want to mention it again. It's the Greek word liturgia, where we get our English word liturgy from. Now, it's originally it's kind of a secular word, and it refers to someone who's a public servant, a servant of the people. So that word was brought into the religious, parlance, and we think of it, in terms of religious service as serving God's people, being a servant of God's people. And as a little aside, I think it's when we understand the meaning of this word and how it relates to the high priests being servants of the people, I think when we think about that word in those terms, it helps us to understand and appreciate the reason and the justification for the great anger and fury that Jesus displayed during his earthly ministry when he encountered the chief priests and the Pharisees. Because the priesthood was designed, and he's talking here, the author of Hebrews here is talking really about the ideal, but the priesthood was designed, the priests were designed to be servants of God's people. But by Jesus' time, the priests were not the servants of the people. They had become lords over the people. Instead of the law being to serve the people, the law was turning the people into slaves. And as if the law wasn't enough, they were adding new laws on top of the laws that God had already given them. And so that's why, if you remember, Jesus had some interesting names that he called the chief priests. He called them broods of vipers, whitewashed tombstones, hypocrites. And speaking of that word hypocrite, I think it's important to know, when we use that word hypocrite in our modern language, modern English, we use it to mean somebody who doesn't practice what they preach, who doesn't really believe what they say, that says one thing and does another, and that's true. But thinking about first century culture and how at that time Greek theater and Roman theater were still the big things, and that word actually came out of the theater. A hypocrite is actually originally not a negative word. It was a word that meant an actor on a stage. It was someone who was in Greek or Roman theater who came on the stage and portrayed a part. Usually, I think the actual hypocrite were the ones who wore those masks. And so when Jesus told the chief priest, "You were a hypocrite," he was saying they were playing a part. They were just actors. They were just wearing a mask. They were pretending to be a priest. They were pretending to be servants of God's people, but they really weren't. Now, it does mean also you could say that they didn't practice what they preached. Yes, that's true too. But the original meaning of his calling them hypocrites was to say they were actors only. They were false. They were pretending to be something that they weren't. And so it's easy to see why Jesus was so angry and furious with those chief priests, because they were supposed to be servants of the people, in the meaning of the word minister, being a servant of the people. But they had become lords of the people. They had put burdens on the people that they wouldn't even offer a finger of their own to help them lift. And for that reason, he called them all those nice little names. So anyway, that had nothing to do with the context of this. That was just bonus content free of charge. But Jesus had received this ministry to be a servant of God's people. But his specific ministry, his specific service, was superior to theirs, and the theirs here refers back to verse 3, the human high priests, was superior to the human high priests. So again, he's making this comparison and contrasting the efficacy or the power or the effect of Jesus' ministry with the human high priest. And of course, he concludes that his was superior. Then he says his ministry is also as a mediator. And that word mediator means literally a go-between or a reconciler. The idea of coming between two warring parties and bringing them together. And that's what the high priest was really supposed to be, because I think we've talked about this before. Even the human high priests, in their work in the tabernacle, they represented God to the people, but they represented the people to God as well. They were supposed to be a mediator to help bring God and the people together. But there was a limit to what the human high priest could do, because as we already established in the previous chapter, the human high priests were saddled with the same sin nature as all the rest of us. So they had their own sins and weaknesses to deal with. So there was a limit to what their mediation could do. But Jesus' mediation was able to go farther than what they could do, was able to accomplish what they could not accomplish. So once again, his ministry as a mediator was superior, because it says he's a superior minister of a better covenant. Now we're going to get to the word covenant again in a minute. I want to just kind of jump over it now and get to the rest of the verse. And it's founded on better promises. And so again, and really the word covenant and promise have a lot in common, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But the promise that the human high priests could provide the people, once again, was limited by their own sin, their own weaknesses, their own human frailties, and what they could do and what they couldn't do. So what they were able to promise is inferior to what Jesus was able to promise through his ministry. So really this verse is just a continuation of the same contrast of the superiority of Christ as our great high priest. He served in the superior sanctuary or tabernacle, which was what he was talking about in the first 5 verses, has a superior ministry, has a superior promises, better promises. So then that leads us into verse 7, which asks the question, in my mind, what's wrong with it, that is, the covenant, anyway? Verse 7 says, "For if there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another." So the point in this verse is to lead up to what he's going to start talking about in verse 8, the new covenant. He is setting up this idea that there was a first covenant, and then there is a new covenant. And then obviously there was something lacking in that first covenant. And when we say, you know, the word there, wrong, is a word that means blameless or faultless. I don't think that his intention is to say that there was anything wrong, you know, in a moral sense with the old covenant. But what there was, it did have a fault in that, just like all these other things we've been talking about for weeks, it could not fully accomplish what needed to be accomplished in the redemption of mankind. It could only point to or picture what Christ as the ultimate great high priest could do. So that was its fault, that it was powerless to really accomplish in the fullest sense what needed to be accomplished. So what he's saying is, it's sort of, you know, the old hypothetical question or that you put in, and that is, why is there need for a new one if the old one was able to do what it needed to do? So the fact that there is a new covenant means that there was something lacking with the old covenant. So the point here is to understand the significance and the relationship of this new covenant, which is really the content of the rest of chapter 8, is essentially a quotation of what is called the new covenant. We need to familiarize ourselves with what the prior covenants are. In other words, if there is a new covenant, that means there must have been an old covenant. And if there needed to be, his point in verse 7 is, if he needed to be a new covenant, what was wrong with the old one? Or what was lacking in the old covenant? And that's where I want us to jump in our time machine, because we need to look at the old covenant and see what about it is that requires the new covenant to be established. Okay? So we're going to familiarize ourselves then with these prior covenants. And so this is going to be like a little mini-series within Hebrews. But the interesting thing is it's going to bring us back to the end of chapter 8 in a really neat, dovetailed way. But first of all, before we get into the details, we have to ask the question, well, what does he mean by covenant? He's talked about this covenant. There's a new covenant, so what was wrong with the old covenant? You know, Jesus was a better mediator of a better covenant. What then is a covenant? Well, this really deserves, you know, we mentioned it briefly a couple of weeks ago because the word covenant came up and we did talk about it. But I didn't go into a lot of detail about it because I wanted to save it for this lesson. You know, when we use the word covenant, it's really kind of an obsolete word in modern English. We don't use it very much. About the only place I have ever encountered it outside of the Bible has been like the covenants you have in like a homeowners association. I know you had one in your old neighborhood. Do you have one in your new neighborhood? Okay. But a covenant in that context was really just a list of things you weren't allowed to do, right? Or things if you did want to do them, you had to get permission. And that's kind of, they called that a covenant usually. Did they call it that in your homeowners association?
Yeah, they did.
Now, I don't know, you guys may have encountered it somewhere else, but that's the only place I ever remember seeing the word covenant outside the Bible in modern English. So it's kind of, when people hear it, it's kind of like an obsolete term that we really don't understand. So that's why I want us to really understand what it means. Now, the New Testament word, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, it was mentioned in, I think, chapter 6. The Greek word means a disposition of property, like in a will, like a last will and testament would say, I just, when I die, I'm giving this property to so and so, disposing of that property in a defined, specific way. So the point behind it is that it's not any kind of a joint obligation or a joint coming together. In other words, if you're the heir in a will, you don't go and negotiate that. I mean, that's just something that the person says, I'm going to bequeath this to you. You don't go in and negotiate. It's not a contract, it's anything like that. It's just this person says, when I die, you get this, okay? It's an act of obligation that one person decides towards another, making a promise. That I just decide, when I die, I'm leaving you my guns, or whatever. So.
Thank you.
I'm gonna get some of them, I'm just saying.
Some of them. I don't know. You may not need all 15 of them, I don't know.
I'll take the AR.
But I think but the interesting thing about it is, you've heard me talk about the word Septuagint, right? The Septuagint,
Yeah.
it's just a fancy word, but what it means is it's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. They called that the Septuagint. Well, this is the word, diatheke, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, that is used to translate the Hebrew word in the Old Testament for covenant. So when you see the word covenant in the Septuagint, it's this Greek word. So that's how they used, and so that's why it's translated that way in the Greek New Testament. So it's more important then to spend time about the Old Testament word that is translated covenant. Now, this is interesting, I think. It's a little brutal, to tell you the truth. The word covenant kind of sanitizes the concept a little, okay? Because when we think of the word covenant, we tend to think of something in writing, something you write up and make a PDF document about it. It just really sanitizes the whole thing. But going back to ancient, thousands of years BC culture, the Old Testament word, berit, I think is how it's pronounced. It is from a root word which means to cut or divide. And the way it was used originally in that root word was the idea of like cutting a piece of meat, like you would cut a steak. You cut a piece off because you were going to divide it to people, or you were going to eat it yourself, like cutting a piece of steak or cutting off the turkey leg. That's kind of the root of the word. It meant to cut. The reason, however, that it came to be a symbol or a representation or a word to describe an allegiance or cooperation between two parties, like two kings or something like that, has to do with this kind of what we would consider somewhat brutal ceremony, is that there would actually be an animal that they would cut in half, and that each person who participated in this agreement would walk between the two halves of the animal. It was, in a way, it was kind of like a blood oath. It was kind of like you've probably seen in old adventure movies and fantasy movies where somebody would make an oath and they would take their dagger and cut their hand and let the blood seep out. And that was kind of like a blood oath. You were essentially promising on your life that you were going to fulfill whatever that promise was. This is kind of where that was fantasy. This was reality. It was really what they used to do back then. And it was kind of like like I said, a blood oath, where the people, maybe they're kings, maybe they're city leaders, maybe they're two warring tribes or something, but if they agreed to have a peace treaty, then the two leaders would each walk between those severed pieces of the animal. And I guess in context, it was probably symbolizing I'm swearing on my life, so that if I break this oath, my penalty is being cut in half like this animal was cut in half, I suppose. That's kind of the symbolism. That's the word covenant in the Hebrew. And so that's why I say the English word covenant kind of sanitizes that idea, but it's an oath that is being sworn on your life under penalty of being cut in half yourself and dying. The interesting thing is, in Genesis chapter 15, we see this actually happening literally, where we see God doing this literally for Abram. In the context of part of the covenant we'll talk about later, in Genesis 15, he actually has Abram take an animal, cut it in half, and a theophany, basically, a visual representation of God, actually walks between the two pieces. And it's actually in Genesis 15 where you see this occurring. And it's literally God doing this, and symbolizing that it's essentially on God's own life that he's making this promise. My point in all of that is I want to be clear about the seriousness of what a covenant is in the Old Testament sense. It is a promise, but it's much more than a promise, because you can just break a promise. You can forget about a promise. You can water down a promise. This is an oath that a person takes on their life by their own blood. And so that's the seriousness of what a covenant is. And this is the context by which God makes these promises, swears these oaths that we're going to talk about in the coming weeks. So even though in secular usage the word covenant is basically like a treaty between two kings or nations, it's a promise of non-aggression, mutual defense, that sort of thing. God chose this concept as the basis of how to describe his interaction and relationship with mankind, and sort of redefined it for this purpose. And the covenant is really the basis of all of his dealings with us up through Christ. It's interesting that while I'm sure if you've been around church and Sunday school as long as we all have, you've probably heard the covenants talked about before, but I don't really think they get the attention they deserve, because in many ways they are the foundation of all theology. Because the covenants really are the foundation of the establishment of Judaism, and we know that Christianity is an outgrowth and fulfillment of the promises of Judaism. So really everything from the nation of Israel all the way through Christianity and our faith has its foundation in these covenants. So they really are theologically and historically the foundations of everything that we hold dear as Christians. And so I don't think, and I'm speaking to myself as a teacher as well, I don't think we give them enough attention when we talk about theology, because they are so rooted in ancient history and ancient tradition as far as what a covenant is. And I think maybe that's why. But I don't think we need to lose sight of how important they are. So, and there's two things that are important, vital importance, when we think about the covenants being foundational to our understanding of Christian theology. One is that they are unilateral. That is to say, one-sided. God promising to do something. But there is never this sense within these covenants, and we'll see when we go into the detailed articles of these covenants, that we are not expected to agree in any way. In other words, they're not contracts. You know, we think of a covenant almost like a contract, is the way we tend to think of that word. A contract, you know, two people or two parties come together and they negotiate and they each agree to do certain things. I mean, that's what a contract is you agree to do something, I agree to do something, so now we have this contract. But if either one of us fails to fulfill our part of it, what happens to the contract? It becomes null and void. I mean, it goes away, because if I fail to do what I said, you don't have to do what you said. You know, when you buy a house, you enter into a contract, you know, with the bank, the mortgage holder, and they agree to lend you the money to pay to the seller, and the other side of that is you get to live in this house. Well, if you stop paying it, they don't have to let you live in the house anymore. And guess what? Out you go. When you look at the way these covenants are worded in the Old Testament, they are not mutual agreements. Nobody goes to God and says, let's work out a deal. We probably wish, sometimes we try to do that, but that's not what these covenants are. There's no sense in which Abraham or Moses or David or any of the ones that we're going to talk about in the coming weeks came to God and said, let's make a deal. And God said, okay, I'll do this if you do that. No, God sovereignly came and made these oaths. And in no way was it bilateral. In no way was it a mutual agreement. It was God saying, I'm going to do this, period. So it was unilateral, one-sided. It was all based on God's sovereignty. The second thing is that they were unconditional. There was no sense in which the recipients of that covenant had to perform in any particular way, had to accomplish any particular thing, had to do any particular thing in order for those covenants to be in place. There was never a time when, after a while, God would say, oh, you know what, you failed to meet Article 3, Section 2, Paragraph 3, so sorry, it's no longer valid. That never happened. The covenants are not contracts. The covenants are sovereign oaths of God that are not dependent on our performance. They are unconditional. They're dependent solely on God's will, solely on His sovereignty, do not require any action or performance of our part, on our part. They are unconditional and unilateral. So that is extremely important when we think about how that relates to the promises of God. We talk so much about the little p promises of God that are all part of these covenants. The covenants are more like the big category under which the individual promises fall, okay? The promises of God are never dependent upon whether or not we deserve them or earn them or are worthy of them or accomplish anything in particular. They are unconditional. And that's important for us because we know, just like he's talked about the high priests, who themselves were sinners and had to go and offer sacrifices for their own sins before they could offer for the rest of the people. We couldn't possibly live up to any kind of a requirement. If we had to hold up our end of the bargain, we couldn't do it. And it's interesting when I mentioned about how in Genesis 15 it actually talks about God walking between the pieces to do that covenant. It never said that Abraham did, because it was not a two-way thing. It wasn't us meeting God in the middle somewhere. It wasn't Abraham having to fulfill some requirement before it would go into effect. It was all God's sovereignty. It was all God's oath. It was unconditional and unilateral. And we have to understand that, because in no other way can we understand the grace of God other than the unconditional covenants that the grace of God is expressed through to us. So that's why it is so important. So what is a covenant? What are the covenants? This is an outline of what we're going to discuss in the weeks to come. In Hebrews 8, he talks about the Old Covenant, or the way he calls it, the first covenant, versus a new covenant. So that kind of implies that there's two. Well, there really are more than two, because really him saying the first covenant was a way of summarizing really a number of covenants. Most theologians recognize that there were 5 specific covenants that were established by God in the Old Testament. Now there's probably hundreds of individual promises that God has made. But all of those promises sort of fall under these broader categories of covenants. The first one we will see is, I don't know if I can pronounce this correctly, Noahic covenant or Noahic covenant.
Noahic, maybe like
Noahic.
like Mosaic for Moses,
Okay.
maybe.
Good. We'll go with that.
That would be my guess.
We'll go with that. Say it again.
Noahic.
Noahic covenant. I can't even say it. The
No
Noahic
way.
Covenant.
No way. Ick.
The No Way covenant, right?
No way. Ick.
This particular one is the first one that is explicitly a covenant, explicitly expressed as a covenant in the Old Testament in Genesis 9. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time on that covenant simply because, and you'll see when we get to it, it isn't really specifically and explicitly involved in what we will call the old covenants that lead up to the new covenant. And I don't want to go into much detail till we get there, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. It's not really part of the old covenant, but it was definitely a covenant. The most important one and foundational one, and the one where we'll probably spend the most time, is what is referred to as the Abrahamic covenant, which is initially mentioned in Genesis 12, but really runs all the way through Genesis chapter 22. God continues because that covers many, many years of Abraham's life, between 12 and 22. And during Abraham's life, God continues to reaffirm and to expand the articles or the specific promises that make up the Abrahamic covenant. Next is the Mosaic covenant, which is established in Deuteronomy 28. And after that, the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7. And then this is how we dovetail back into Hebrews, because the fifth one is the so-called New Covenant, which I misspelled it. I can't believe that spell check didn't catch it, but I've misspelled Jeremiah. But it's established in Jeremiah 31. This is what the author of Hebrews quotes in the next verse in Hebrews chapter 8, and finishes. And the quotation of the New Covenant finishes chapter 8, leading into chapter 9. So by going through these, and then the ultimate one being the New Covenant, that will bring us right back into Hebrews chapter 8. And I think it's interesting. Theologians, they're just so smart and clever with their naming convention, right? The Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant. Isn't that clever how they named all of those? But I think the interesting thing is the New Covenant. The New Covenant is the only one that doesn't have a man's name associated with it. And part of that is just the practical effect that it wasn't a covenant that God specifically announced to a person the way the other ones were. But I think and I think the reason for that, and this is just Chuck's speculation, the only one not named after a specific man is because this is the one that I think we'll see is the fulfillment of the other ones, but it is the one that represents what Christ did for us, the fulfillment of the law through Christ. We see this in the New Covenant, and it isn't associated with any human man. I mean, it's associated with Jesus, but I mean in terms of humanity. It isn't one that is associated with a fallible, sinful man. It is associated purely with Christ. So that's why I think it's no real accident. I just think it's interesting. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it today. I mean, I've actually got the slides for the Noahic covenant. Noahic covenant.
Noahic.
I can't say it.
Just think no way, and then add ick at the end.
And the Abrahamic covenant. But obviously, we're not going to get to those today because I don't want to rush through it and try to do it in 5 minutes. There's no way. There's just too much there. So that's where we're going to leave it, and we'll come back, and the Noahic covenant
There you go.
won't take us long. Because just as a preview, like I said, it's not really the one, its purpose is different than the others. And so there's only one real article or promise within it. And so that will only take us a few minutes to go over. The Abrahamic covenant, though, is a whole study in and of itself. So that's what we'll focus on next week, is those two.